I'm Ben Myers with Ask4TR, located at www.ask4tr.com. Joining us today is Mr. Francis Green, who is a current attorney as well as former police officer out of Lafayette, Louisiana, as well as a Minnesota Attorney General. Very nice to meet you. It's good to see you on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let me ask you this. As a former police officer down in Lafayette, you used to work for the University Police Department there. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, while you were there for how long?
3 years.
Now, during that 3-year period, you went through certain training. Is that right?
That's correct. I went through the K-9 Law Enforcement Training Academy, which is post-certified.
Now, going through that training, you have certain information that is applicable throughout the entire country. Is that right?
That's correct.
So now, have you had an opportunity to look at some of the recent incidents that have occurred throughout the country, specifically the case involving Alton Sterling down in Baton Rouge, Louisiana?
I am familiar with that case.
So now, looking at it from a law enforcement perspective, and looking at what the officers did, the behavior engaged in by Mr. Sterling, is there anything that causes you some concern or alarm in watching that video?
Well, I mean, you had an individual who appeared to be pinned down by 2 rather large police officers, and he ends up dying. So that in and of itself raises some flags. So that was a very troubling incident.
So now looking at it, or rolling it back and understanding what the current facts are, which I believe are that he was selling some CDs or DVDs in front of a local store, looking at his behavior not being that of threatening the officers, is there any concern that you have when the officers approached him and ultimately leading up to his death?
Well, I mean, depending on how the call came in, I mean, if he just was selling CDs,
right.
I mean, there's nothing unlawful about that, right? I mean, the police should have just approached him if they had some concerns, and there wouldn't be a concern for their life. So they would probably approach it just as they were approaching anyone on the streets.
So now, my understanding is that what the actual call was that Mr. Sterling was waving around or was exposing a firearm. So adding that to the equation, does that change your review of the officer's behavior?
Well, I think it would if they went to an incident where someone had a firearm. It certainly may elevate the level of response. However, let's keep in mind that Louisiana is an open carry state.
Right.
So there are a lot of folks who conceivably can be walking around lawfully with a firearm.
So looking at the situation, knowing that Mr. Sterling is an African-American male, these 2 officers, I believe, were both white, do you think that race played any role in the behavior that law enforcement exhibited?
Well, I mean, I can't get into the officers' minds.
Of course.
But obviously, I think that, race factors into people's perception of circumstances and people. And, I think race matters. I mean, I think police officers are no different than any other person. Race is relevant in society. People treat people based on race. Sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's unintentional. So I would say his race may have been a factor.
So now, because race is a factor in society as a matter of generality, do you look at the response from the officers in the Sterling situation, and then you look at it in conjunction with the Javier Allman situation in Ohio? What do you see as the differentiation between those 2 situations? Okay,
well, the Ohio situation, from what I believe you're discussing, is the case in which the gentleman pulled out a knife on the officer, and the officer pretty much exercised the most remarkable amount of restraint I had ever seen, and did not end up killing that person. In fact, another officer showed up and tased him, and they were able to subdue him without deadly force.
And in fact, my recollection after viewing the video, and we'll put the video up here in a moment, but after reviewing the video, the officer shoots Mr. Allman once when he pulls out a knife and goes after the officer, but then, again, like you said, exercised remarkable restraint and doesn't shoot him again, even though Mr. Allman is going after the officer for quite some time.
Correct. And I believe that the individual was actually yelling to the officer to kill me, kill me, kill me. Which is pretty interesting that he walked away from that incident as opposed to being carried away.
We keep making reference to this video. Let's take a moment and take a look at this remarkable video picturing an Ohio police officer and Mr. Javier Allman.
Okay, what's your name?
Carlos. The Spanish for Charles.
What's your last name?
Umbrella.
How you spell it?
A-M-B-R R.
Two L's? R?
E. L. A.
You have a social security number?
No.
You have anything on you that tells you who you are?
No, man.
What you got in your backpack?
Dirty clothes.
Alright, let's just set it down here. 7 King 11, code 6.
7 King 11.
7 King 11, I'll be southbound 75 at the 14 over 9. I'll be out with one subject that was walking. Keep your hands out of your pockets for me.
Sorry, sir.
Here, let's walk up to my cruiser real quick. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have you place your hands on the back of my cruiser. I'm going to pat you down for officer safety. I'm going to pat you down for
Kill me now! Kill me! Motherfucker! Kill me now!
7 King 11, shots fired, shots fired!
Kill me!
Sir, miss squad, I shot one, he has a knife!
I'm gonna kill you!
Sir, get down! Sir, get down!
I'm gonna kill you!
Sir, get down! Get down! Get down!
Kill me, motherfucker!
Get down! Stay down!
Kill me!
Stay down!
Broadcast officer.
Stay down!
Fired.
Stay down!
75-14-9.
Stay down!
Assistance.
Stay down! Drop the knife!
Kill me!
Drop the fucking knife! Drop the knife!
Kill me! Kill me!
You know, every time I see that video, it's remarkable to me that you have this one gentleman going after the police officer with a knife and still walks away from the incident with his life. It's absolutely remarkable. But I think what is more intriguing to me is, especially from an attorney perspective, is how did law enforcement come into contact with this individual in the first place? So looking at it from your mind's eye, you're seeing this gentleman walking down the street and the police pull up on him. From a law enforcement perspective, why would the officer waste his time or stop this guy who's clearly just walking down the street? Why would law enforcement come into contact with him?
Well, from what I understand, he was walking along the freeway.
Right.
And I think there was some concerns over safety issues, and it may be against the law to walk on a freeway. I don't know what the particular law is in Ohio relating to this, but the officer obviously had a basis to speak with the gentleman if he thought that that either his safety or someone else's safety was at risk.
I mean, in generality, we're dealing with a public policy or a public safety issue. So you see a gentleman walking down I-75 in Ohio. I believe from the video that we just saw, there was a comment by the officer that was made saying, somebody called in saying there was some lone person walking down the highway. Is that enough for law enforcement to come into contact with an individual who's clearly not driving a car, just walking down a highway?
Yeah, I think it would be. I think it would be enough of a basis to walk up to an individual. It's not, for purposes of the Fourth Amendment, it's not considered an actual stop. I mean,
Right.
It's just an officer can walk up to someone and talk with them and inquire basically why they're there and what their condition is to decide.
But there has to be some reasonable articulable suspicion. There has to be some thing there for the officer to have contact with an individual. It just can't be willy-nilly or I think the legal terminology is caprice behavior. There has to be something there, and I think it was. You see Mr. Allman walking down the street, I mean, he's on a public highway.
Sure. I mean, I think they probably had articulable suspicion.
Right.
Whether or not it was needed or not, it's debatable. I think it depends on how the officer approached them. I mean, if it was considered an actual stop for the Fourth Amendment, then you need articulable suspicion. But if it was an encounter, for example, if you're just walking to someone who's in a public place, that's not an actual stop.
Right.
An officer can walk up on someone. But in this particular case, it might have very well been a stop. But I think the officer would have had a basis to stop on that.
Just sheerly on the fact that he's walking down a major interstate,
Correct.
Potentially posing a public safety issue.
I would think so, yes.
So now let me roll forward just a little bit with you. After looking at the video and seeing what happens between the time the officer comes into contact with Mr. Allman and when he's trying to take him back to a squad car for purposes of patting him down, that's a certain process in and of itself. So as a former police officer, why would the police officer want to pat down this gentleman who's walking down the highway?
Well, I mean, he doesn't know who the gentleman is. He
Right.
doesn't know if he's armed. So, I mean, it's a question of officer safety. And so if he's going to be providing transportation, or if he's even dealing with him in any type of an encounter, if he has reason to fear for his safety, or if he just wants to ensure that his safety is not put at risk, he very, very appropriately, I think, patted the gentleman down to check for the presence of any weapons.
And that's legal, right?
And that would be legal if you have articulable suspicion.
But even outside of that, the fact that the officer believed that he needed some way to check to make sure that this person wasn't going to pose a threat, an officer can do that if they have a reasonable basis to believe that there is a threat that this person may pose.
I agree.
So looking at that, seeing how he tried to pat him down, and then it kind of goes off the rails from that point in time where I guess he spins out of the officer's custody and then comes at him with a knife.
Right.
From a law enforcement perspective, what is an officer allowed to do at that particular juncture when somebody is yielding a deadly weapon?
Well, I mean, there's what's called the force continuum.
Okay.
And the force continuum is it's basically the level of force that an officer can use under the circumstances. So officers must only use a reasonable amount of force. And so the continuum starts with officer presence, and it involves open hand control, voice control, open hand control, hard, empty hand control, an intermediate weapon, and then ultimately deadly force.
An intermediate weapon is what?
Like a taser or a police baton or something that's non-lethal.
Okay.
And in the case of a threat of deadly force, an officer is allowed to escalate to one level beyond the threat. So in this case, the individual wielded a knife. We wielded a knife at him, which means that the officer was justified in, at that point, using deadly force.
So now looking at that and the fact that this officer clearly had the ability to use lethal force, looking at that situation, then turning back to the Alton Sterling situation in Baton Rouge, why would officers in Baton Rouge who have the suspect subdued use deadly force at point blank range? And the incident in Ohio where the officer clearly has the right or has the responsibility or has the wherewithal, the authorization to use deadly force, and he doesn't take it, but the officers in Baton Rouge do.
Yeah, I mean, and that's why these two videos raise some very troubling questions. Why was the response so disproportionate in the Alton Sterling case versus in the case of the individual in Ohio? It appeared as though the officer showed remarkable restraint.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, and that's why people in minority communities especially have so much concern and outrage over the way blacks in particular have been treated by law enforcement. And so it's hard to ignore the racial component here.
Well, then all of this seems to spiral into incidents that occur like in Dallas. So you have the incident that occurred in Ohio where this gentleman who's purportedly a lighter complexion or even white, overtly white, even though you come to find out that he's a Latino, you have that situation which is kind of pushed aside. And then 3-4 months later, or 5 months later, you have the situation in Baton Rouge. And then 24 to 48 hours after that, you now have a new incident that occurred here in Minnesota where you have the taking of a life of Mr. Castile. It all seems to culminate into being an issue of race and not necessarily an issue of public safety.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that, the other side obviously wants to claim, and the police, I think, oftentimes want to justify their actions.
Right.
And they will frequently articulate that there was some threat. Mm-hmm. And I think even in those cases, the officers are probably going to claim that the individual was going for their weapon or that they felt some reason to use deadly force. Yeah. And I can assure you that in the case of Alton Sterling, there's a narrative out there right now that basically people are saying that he was reaching for his gun and therefore that's why the officers shot him.
But with that argument though, my concern is how do you justify something like that when it's so clear that the officers have him pinned down? I mean, you're not talking about one cop to one person. You got two officers, and we'll put this video up also, but you have two officers who are holding him down to the point where one officer just said, you hear the word gun, and the other officer puts a gun in his chest and pulls the trigger 6 times.
Yeah, I mean, I look at this and it's really troubling to look at this footage. And I mean, these 2 officers were pretty large guys.
Right.
And yes, Mr. Sterling was a big man as well, but they seemed to have him under control. They were tossing him around pretty well.
Right.
And you know, in that video, now remember, prior to that, he had gotten tased, he had gotten tackled. And so this notion that somehow, you know, he's supposed to stay on the ground still when you have 2 men on top of you, he probably was thinking to himself, what did I do wrong? I'm outraged. He's got his adrenaline flowing, and then he probably can't breathe because these 2 large men are on top of him. Right. Is it inconceivable that you're going to be writhing around in pain or maybe moving around in a way that could suggest that, you know, hey, I can't lay here with you on top of me. So any type of movement at all will result in you being killed. I mean, I don't think that type of narrative that is being created where black men are just supposed to just lay down and just take it. I don't think that's fair. I think there is a race component, and really it reflects, I think, a lack of understanding of how or what is going through the mind and what is happening to someone as they are being, you know, handled like that by two large police officers.
You know what I find intriguing is that for the last couple, I guess, decades, there's been this push through the police department of trying to be more culturally sensitive or trying to say, well, we're going to do something better in order to relate to African Americans or to minorities in general. But it seems like the more discussion about what to do to have a better interaction with law enforcement or African Americans or minorities in law enforcement seems to culminate into more death or more disrespect of minority communities. What goes through the mind of a police officer when they are coming into contact with a minority?
Well, I mean, I think that, again, just in the case of society, I mean, we have a history in this country where race matters, and where African American people have gotten the short end of the stick. And African American people in this country have been treated poorly by law enforcement. And that is not just a comment I'm making. That's something that you hear countless people of color make. And so you know we live in a society where race is important. And I think that as a police officer, whether or not you have intentional or unintentional biases, those are going to affect you. I mean, the perceptions of black men, the stereotypes that we put out there of black men in this country, that they're more aggressive, that they're angry, that they're criminal. I mean, these are the kinds of things that as a police officer, whether or not you're a good person, whether or not you have black friends, whether or not you don't have a racist bone in your body, from what you can tell, you will nonetheless be influenced by that type of perception that's put out there of black males. And I think that whether the officer set out there to kill someone, I mean, I don't think he did, but I think in the situation, I think officers sometimes take into account their biases, which in many cases are not even known to them.
Yeah, I absolutely appreciate that. We'll be back in just a moment with Attorney Francis Green.
For the record, proof to show the truth.
And we're back with Ask for TR. Joining us today again is Francis Green, former police officer out of Lafayette, Louisiana, as well as former Minnesota Assistant Attorney General. Now, Mr. Green, you and I have talked about police officers and the engagement that they have with minorities. But you specifically have a certain tie-in to the police in that you're not only a former police officer, but you also have a family that's police officers. In fact, you come from a background or a culture of the police. Is that correct?
Yeah, I do have family members who are in law enforcement or who have been in law enforcement.
In fact, most of your family is law enforcement. Well, so you've been really influenced by that blue shield or the wall of blue, so to speak.
Well, I mean, I don't know that I would say I was influenced by the blue shield of all of blue as much as, I grew up in a household where my father, is a police officer, and I was taught, to follow the rules and do the right thing, and my father has very high ethical standards, and I'd like to say that he taught me those well, and that's how I live my life.
So now, within the police culture, you have positives and you have negatives.
That's correct.
The positives are that law enforcement, your father, your family members, they risk their lives every day in order to keep law-abiding citizens safe, right?
That's absolutely right.
But then you also have a darker side of law enforcement, the dark blue shield, or the blue shield that protects law enforcement from mistakes that they may have made or that they're actually making. Talk to our viewers about that particular side of the negative law enforcement culture.
Well, I mean, what you're referring to, I think it's sometimes referred to as the blue wall of science, or a blue wall of silence, or the thin blue line. And it's the perception that police officers protect their own.
Right.
They won't tell on another police officer that police officers engaged in wrongdoing. And so unfortunately, that is a subculture within law enforcement. I mean, I do think that most police officers are very dedicated, very committed to their jobs, and they take their jobs seriously. But at the same time, I do agree that there is a tendency sometimes within that subculture where officers may not follow the rules, or may not call behaviors that they should be calling out by others.
So now, looking at that particular culture in general, like any other culture, it's influenced by what you see, what your interactions with certain people are. Tell us about what has impacted the culture of police officers or the police.
Well, I think one of the things, police officers are human beings. I mean,
Right.
We're, as just living in American society, we're fed images in the media of people. Let's take black males, for example. We oftentimes see negative images of black males. We see black males as being criminal, being angry, being hostile, being a threat.
Right.
And we internalize those images. And as police officers, I think they're subjected to that imagery as well.
And do you think that imagery, even though law enforcement goes through specific training, they go through a lot in order to try to push that stuff aside, do you think the training somehow intercepts or beats back this constant media frenzy, or this constant feeding by the media of what African American men look like, or what they're perceived as being, or that they're dangerous? Do you think that the training is sufficient in order to somehow counteract all that imagery?
Well, I think the training can certainly be a good thing. I don't know that the training is going to necessarily, erase all biases that police officers might internalize.
Right.
But I do believe that training is key. I think it starts at the top. The leadership is important. I think you have to have good screening of police. You have to make sure that you're bringing the right types of people onto the departments. And so I think
Right.
that you also have to focus on the idea that in order for a culture to change, the people within it have to buy into it. And I think that comes from leadership. Leadership has to ensure that, look, we're gonna hold ourselves accountable. And why not? I mean, in every profession, you want people, the bad apples, to be called out, right?
Right.
I mean, if in our profession as attorneys, I mean, we don't want bad lawyers out there. It makes us look bad.
Right.
So why not the police? Why not the police do the same thing? And
But
that's not asking much, I don't think.
Right, no, and I agree with you, but I guess the bigger question is, why don't they? What incentive do the police have to not call out these bad eggs? I mean, these situations in Baton Rouge, situations in Falcon Heights, Minnesota, all the situations that we have going around all the way down from Florida, all the way up to New York, all the way out to California, all this stuff going on involving police shootings, I would think that law enforcement would not want to take life, that they would have every reason to try to use any form of force in order to save or preserve life. What more incentive do they need in order to, from my view, do the right thing and not take a life of another human being? What more do they need?
Well, I mean, I think that's the operative question, I would think. I mean, it would seem rational
Right.
that they would not want to engage in behaviors that reflect unfavorably on the department. But at the same time, I mean, I think some of it is the notion that oftentimes police officers feel a sense that, look, we have a tough job to do. You don't understand it. Only another police officer can understand it.
Right.
And so you develop these intense bonds with your brethren. And I think that's sort of the source of the sort of bonding and the idea that police officers cover up other police officers' behavior. I mean, that is completely unacceptable. And I think part of it, you need to make sure that you have a department that has conversations about this kind of thing. You need to talk to police about the importance of making sure that you are held accountable, making sure that this type of you have to do training to show police this is how you deal with different circumstances. This is you have to talk about race.
Right.
You can't pretend that it doesn't exist. I mean, I think a lot of these issues get swept under the rug because there's just not enough time and attention focused directly on what we're trying to address, which is, I mean, if we're talking about a race problem, you have to identify it as such, and you have to be able to instill in the officers that these we're not indicting you. We're not saying that you're bad people. We're not calling you racist. But these are things that can influence you. These are images, and you have to be aware of that. And we have to work together to ensure that that you treat people equally, regardless of race.
Well, what's interesting to me is that there's been this conversation about what the police's job is. And you look at what's on the side of the car, in most communities, it's protect and serve, or to protect with honor and pride. But yet, these officers won't even get out of their cars to engage in real police work, like community policing, where they get out and they know who they're protecting. And it's a concern from my perspective, because what it seems to lead up to is a lack of or a engagement of dehumanization for the very people that they're supposed to be protecting. So they see somebody on the street, they don't identify them as a human being, they're just a person, not with a family, but just a person. And I think getting more back to the police being community members, police being people that have a stake in that community, may be one way to lend itself to fixing or countering all this bad, negative police behavior. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be critical. I think that you probably need to go a step further. I agree that the police should come from the community that they serve.
Right. That would definitely give them a valid stake in that community and themselves.
And the one thing you have to remember is that a police officer's job, whether or not he's successful in his job, depends on whether the community is going to work and cooperate with him.
Right.
And so you have to have good relationships with the community. That is so key toward improving. Not only helping officers to do their jobs, actually, I think it's a public safety issue, and it's also an officer safety issue. Because if the community is looking out for the police and vice versa, I mean, you have cooperation.
It's a partnership.
Absolutely, you have less of a sense that it's an us against them type of situation.
Every time I watch the Alton Sterling video, it's so concerning. Specifically, the fact that he's on the ground. The cop has him. The two officers have him subdued, and then the next thing you see is the officer pull his gun out and kill Mr. Sterling. It's disturbing every time I see that, whether it's here in the studio or on my iPad. It's extraordinarily disturbing. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, it's sickening. I look at that video, and I mean, my heart goes out to the family. It's unnecessary to shoot a man dead when you've already pinned him down on the ground. I mean,
you forced his compliance, and then you go one step further, and you're talking about your force continuum. There's no need to utilize deadly force at that particular juncture. But what's even more concerning is that less than 48 hours after the incident in Baton Rouge with Mr. Sterling, you then have the incident in Falcon Heights, Minnesota, where you have a young man who is being stopped for arguably broken taillight, but then now there's new information now that our studio just received indicating that in fact there may have been an idea by the officer that Mr. Castile was actually the suspect in a robbery. But either way, what's concerning to me is that he's shot point blank in a car, in a closed vehicle next to his girlfriend with a child in the back seat. I mean, it's riveting, it's concerning. I just don't know what to make of it.
Yeah, the Philando Castile situation, I think, to your point about reports of an armed robbery or something to that effect. There's the notion. This is a question that would come to mind as a former police officer. If you believe that this vehicle was involved in, or the subjects inside the vehicle were involved in an armed robbery or any type of felony offense, you would do what's called a felony traffic stop,
right?
Which requires all the occupants to exit the vehicle. You wouldn't approach the vehicle. You would have the occupants exit the vehicle, and at that point, you would have them exit individually. They would have their hands up, and all the officers would have their guns trained on them, and that's if they had done that in this particular instance, if they believed that he had been involved in a felony, then this outcome may not have occurred.
Yeah, before we go too far, let's take a moment and show our audience the Philando Castile video that most people have probably already seen, but for the viewers at home viewing this, it is disturbing, it's extremely alarming, but we are going to show that to you because we do think it's valuable information that you need to see as viewers.
We got pulled over for a busted tail light in the back, and the police he's covered. He killed my boyfriend. He's licensed. He's licensed to carry. He was trying to get out his ID and his wallet out his pocket, and he let the officer know that he had a firearm and he was reaching for his wallet, and the officer just shot him in his arm. We're waiting for a back. I will, sir. No worries. I will. Fuck! He just shot his arm off. We got pulled over on Larpener.
I told him not to reach for it. I told him to get his hand out.
You told him to get his ID, sir, and his driver's license. Oh my God! Please don't tell me he's dead. Please don't tell me my boyfriend just went like that.
Keep your hands where they are, please.
Yes, I will, sir. I'll keep my hands where they are. Please don't tell me this, Lord. Please, Jesus, don't tell me that he's gone. Please don't tell me that he's gone. Please, officer, don't tell me that you just did this to him. You shot 4 bullets into him, sir. He was just getting his license and registration, sir.
Get the female passenger out.
Ma'am, exit the car right now with your hands up. Let me see your hands. Exit now. Keep them up. Keep them up.
Where's my daughter? You got my daughter?
Face away from me and walk backwards. Walk backwards towards me. Keep walking. Keep walking. Keep walking. Keep walking. Get on your knees. Get on your knees.
So now after looking at the Castile matter or the Castillo video, why does the officer have his gun out at the window when the officer, we understand the officer may have believed that he had just committed a robbery?
Yeah, and that is inexplicable. I don't, if that's the information that the officer had, I find it hard to believe that he would have exercised that type of procedure unless he's just clearly not utilizing the what he was taught. Because, you exercise a felony traffic stop if you believe someone is involved in a felony. You don't approach the vehicle the way he did.
Yeah. And I guess the argument from my perspective is, let's assume for a second that the officer did believe that his taillight was out. Does that lend itself any more credence to the officer having his gun out when approaching the vehicle?
Yeah, I wouldn't understand why you would have your gun out.
Right.
I mean, if it's just for a minor traffic stop, you have no reason. You have no reason to pull your weapon out.
And keep in mind, he also had a partner who was on the other side of the vehicle as well.
Right.
So it sounds like the officers observed the occupants from a distance may or may not have believed that a felony had occurred, may or may not have observed a broken taillight, but either way, they come into contact with these 3 occupants, and somehow we have gunplay involved. We have weapons out for what seems to be, in the worst case scenario, somebody committed a robbery, which the officer shouldn't have been at the door anyway. Or the best case scenario, a broken taillight, a basic minor traffic offense. It's hard to rationalize pulling a gun out in either situation and placing the officer at that location with his gun drawn.
Right. And, we didn't see the video beforehand, but I believe there was also some sort of conversation where Mr. Castillo indicated that he had a gun permit.
Right.
And I'm not sure from watching the video or at what point that conversation happened, or whether or not that influenced the officers. But in either case, when the officer approached a vehicle where an individual indicated that he had a gun permit, he wasn't breaking the law. He wasn't violating the law. That's not a reason to pull your gun out.
Right.
Now, if he wanted to stop that vehicle and disarm the occupants, I mean, he definitely had a right to do that if based on officer safety, based on other considerations, he needed to do that. But from what I saw in the video, where he had his gun out and then he ends up shooting this gentleman.
Right.
It doesn't add up.
Well, Mr. Green, thank you so much for joining us. And this has been an interview with Francis Green. Thank you for watching Ask for TR. Please send in your comments or emails to info@ask4tr.com.